Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Lourd Montgomery. Read by Rachel Hartwright. Chapter 5. One evening, some weeks later, Marilia went to a meeting in Charlottetown, the most important town on Prince Edward Island. Mrs. Lynde and Diana's parents went to the meeting too. They all slept in Charlottetown that night. Anne and Matthew stayed at home. They sat in the kitchen. Anne studied her lessons at the table. Suddenly, Diana ran through the door. Her face was very white. "Oh, Anne, please come quickly," she said. "Minnie May is very sick, my sister. She has croup. Maybe she's going to die." Matthew got up quietly and put on his coat. "I'll go for the doctor," he said, and went out. "Don't be afraid, Diana," said Anne. "I know about croup. Mrs. Hammond had 8 children, and they all had it. Wait, Marilia has some medicine. I'll bring it with me." Anne went with Diana to the Barrys' house. The ground was white with snow. When they arrived at the house, Anne went to Minnie May. She was very sick. "Now, Diana, bring me hot water," said Anne. She undressed Minnie May and put her to bed. Then she gave her some medicine. All night Minnie May was very sick, but in the early morning she started to sleep quietly. Matthew then arrived with the doctor. "I'm sorry we're late," he said. "The doctor wasn't at home. I had to wait for him for a long time." The doctor looked at Minnie May. "You did very well, Anne," he said. Anne drove home with Matthew in the snow. When they arrived at Green Gables, Anne went quietly to bed. That afternoon, Marilia was downstairs in the kitchen. She had returned from her travels. "How was the meeting, Marilia?" asked Anne. "Fine," answered Marilia. "Listen, Anne, Mrs. Barry was here this morning, and she told me about Minnie May's croup. She wanted to say thank you to you, and she's also very sorry about the fruit cordial and not believing you. She wants you and Diana to be friends again." "Oh, Marilia, that's wonderful," cried Anne. "Can I go and see Diana now?" "Yes," said Marilia, and smiled. Anne ran quickly to Diana's house. It was cold, and she had forgotten her coat or hat, but she was the happiest girl in Avonlea. The long summer vacation began at the end of June. Mr. Phillips left the Avonlea school, the old minister left the church too, and a new minister arrived. His name was Mr. Allen, and he brought his pretty young wife with him. "I'll ask Mr. and Mrs. Allen to tea on Wednesday," said Marilia. "Oh, Marilia," said Anne excitedly, "can I make a cake for them?" "All right, Anne," said Marilia. "Yes, you can." On Wednesday morning, Anne got up extra early and made her cake. It looked very good. In the afternoon, Anne put flowers around the table, and then Mr. and Mrs. Allen arrived. "The table looks beautiful," they said. Anne felt very happy. She sat at the table with Matthew and Marilia. Matthew wore his best clothes. "Would you like some cake, Mrs. Allen?" asked Anne. "I made it for you." "Oh, yes, please," said Mrs. Allen, and she smiled. Anne cut some cake for Mrs. Allen, and Mrs. Allen put the cake in her mouth and started to eat it. But she didn't look very happy. "Is something wrong?" thought Marilia. She tried some of the cake. "Oh, Anne Shirley, what did you put in this?" she said. Oh, only vanilla, answered Anne. She went to the kitchen and brought back a small bottle. On front of the bottle it said, Best Vanilla. Marilla opened the bottle. This isn't vanilla, she said. It's medicine. Last week I broke the medicine bottle. I put the medicine into this old vanilla bottle. Medicine, said Anne. Oh, no. She ran upstairs to her room. She cried and cried. A little later, Anne heard somebody on the stairs, but she didn't look up. Oh, Marilla, she said, I'm very unhappy. Everybody in Avonlea will hear about my cake. They will laugh at me. I can't go downstairs. I can't look at Mrs. Allen again. I'm very sorry, Marilla. Please tell Mrs. Allen I'm so sorry. You tell her, Anne, said Mrs. Allen. Mrs. Allen, said Anne, looking up in surprise. Yes, it's me, said Mrs. Allen, laughing. Don't cry, Anne. The medicine and the cake was actually very funny. I'm sorry, Mrs. Allen, said Anne. I wanted to make a nice cake for you. I know, said Mrs. Allen. Now please come down and show me your flowers. I'm very interested in flowers. Anne felt happy again. She went downstairs with Mrs. Allen, and nobody said anything else about the cake. A week later, Anne ran into the kitchen at Green Gables. She was very excited. She had a letter in her hand. Mrs. Allen is inviting me to tea tomorrow afternoon. Look at this letter, Marilla. It says, Miss Anne Shirley, Green Gables. Nobody's called me Miss before. The next afternoon, Anne went to tea with Mrs. Allen. I had a wonderful time with Mrs. Allen, she told Marilla later. She's very kind, and she wore a beautiful dress. We talked for a long time. I told her about Mrs. Thomas's and Mrs. Hammond and the orphanage and all of my life, and I told her about Green Gables and the school too. Mrs. Allen told me something interesting. A new teacher is coming to Avonlea after the vacation. Her name is Miss Muriel. Stacy. Isn't that a pretty name? I can't wait to meet her. I'm sure she's going to be an amazing teacher. End of chapter 5.